What did it mean to live in Britain in the 60s? Not just to read about it in history books, but to hear the clatter of milk bottles at dawn, to walk down streets filled with prams and bicycles, and to feel the sudden sense that life was loosening its grip. This is how it looked like to live in the UK in the 60s. The years at the beginning of the decade carried a kind of restraint. Wages were steady, pay packets delivered in brown envelopes, coins counted carefully across kitchen tables. Yet even in those early years, a slow rise in earnings began to shift the shape of the family. By the mid-60s, the money that once just managed to stretch to rent and groceries could now cover something more. A fridge in the kitchen, a television in the corner, or even a car outside the door. Television was perhaps the clearest sign that the private home was becoming connected to a wider world. By the late 60s, 9 out of 10 families had one, transforming evenings into a shared national experience. Coronation Street began in 1960 and quickly became a fixture, its storylines drawing tens of millions. Blue Peter spoke directly to children, while annual broadcasts from the Queen reached nearly every household, their familiarity part of what bound people together. The roads outside told a similar story of transformation. Families who once relied on buses and bicycles began piling into small cars, many for the first time. Seaside holidays that once meant long train rides were suddenly within easy reach by motorway, with the M1 opened just before the decade began, carrying heavier traffic every year. To drive a Ford Cortina or a Morris Minor in the mid-60s was to feel that life itself was speeding up. Inside the home, the change was quieter but no less important. Washing machines and refrigerators began to appear, freeing women from hours of repetitive work. By the end of the decade, central heating was still not universal, but its gradual spread signaled the promise of warmer winters and less reliance on coal. These were not just machines, but symbols of comfort, of moving forward and keeping up with what Britain seemed to be becoming. And then there was the sound. In 1962, the Beatles released their first single, and by 1964, the word Beatlemania was on everyone's lips. Their songs echoed from radios and television sets, while teenagers crowded record shops in numbers never seen before. British music began to dominate not just at home, but abroad, with bands like the Rolling Stones and The Who defining the spirit of a generation. Fashion followed close behind. Mary Quant's miniskirt appeared in the middle years, and by the late 60s, the sight of short hemlines on the high street spoke of a country that had shed the styles of its parents almost overnight. If the home and the high street were changing, so too were the schools that shaped young lives. The 60s was a decade when secondary education became a universal expectation rather than a privilege. The school-leaving age was raised to 15 in 1947, and though the push to extend it further would come later in the 70s, the 60s already saw classrooms expand to accommodate a generation of post-war children. By 1965, comprehensive schools were being introduced, slowly replacing the old tripartite system of grammar, secondary modern, and technical schools. To sit in a classroom in those years was to feel part of an experiment about what Britain's future should look like. Education fed directly into work, and here too the changes were unmistakable. By the middle of the decade, service industries were beginning to employ more people than heavy industry. While the steelworks, shipyards and mines still defined entire regions, new opportunities were opening in offices, retail, and administration. In 1966, around 1 in 3 workers were employed in manufacturing, a figure already sliding from its post-war peak. A clerical job, once a small corner of the economy, was becoming a realistic career path for both men and women, particularly in cities. The position of women in work was shifting. Marriage and motherhood still pulled many women away from the workplace, but the growth of part-time jobs allowed more to earn wages than before. By the late 60s, nearly 1 in 3 married women were in paid employment. Offices and shops began to echo with the sound of female voices, and though equal pay remained a distant goal, the simple fact of being in the workforce signaled a different rhythm of life than the one their mothers had known. On weekends, leisure became its own economy. Football matches drew huge crowds, with stadiums filling every Saturday afternoon. The 1966 World Cup, hosted and won by England, became one of the defining moments of the decade, with more than 32 million watching the final on television. Cinemas, though some losing ground to TV, still carried their own draw. Films like Zulu, 1964, and the James Bond series filled screens with images of heroism and glamour, while in local halls, dances and concerts turned every Friday night into a gathering place for youth. Shopping was also transforming. Chained supermarkets began to spread, changing the experience of buying food. Where once a week's groceries were collected from butchers, greengrocers, and bakers, by the end of the decade, a single shop could provide everything under one fluorescent roof. For families, it wasn't only convenient, but a sign that Britain was stepping into a modern consumer age. And still, daily life was anchored in rituals that had little to do with newness. Coal deliveries, milk rounds, and the sound of the postman's knock remained fixtures of the street. Gas meters had to be fed with coins, and winter mornings still meant scraping frost from inside windows in houses without central heating. It was in the blend of these old habits and new conveniences that the 60s found its texture, a Britain both familiar and forward-leaning at once. Evenings in the 60s were often framed by the flicker of a television set. By 1961, most homes had one, and by the end of the decade, nearly all did. Children sat cross-legged on the carpet, parents in armchairs, the set pulling whole families into one globe. News bulletins carried the weight of distant events into small front rooms, while dramas and light entertainment filled the space with laughter or silence. When the BBC introduced regular colour broadcasts in 1967, the leap felt enormous, though for most, the old black and white box stayed until costs came down. Music stretched even further, shaping what streets sounded like. The Beatles, beginning with a performance in 1963 on Sunday night at the Palladium, shifted the air itself. Crowds gathered in city squares, portable radios pressed to ears, the notes carried through shop doorways and buses. Pirate stations like Radio Caroline broadcast off the coast, filling gaps the BBC would not, until the launch of Radio 1 in 1967 gave the youth audience its own place on the dial. By then, record sales were booming, and whole towns seemed to pulse to the same rhythm. The shape of cities was also being redrawn. Across Britain, new homes rose quickly, estates appearing where fields or bomb sites had been only a few years earlier. In 1968 alone, almost 500,000 houses were built, more than in any year before or since. Tower blocks climbed into the skyline, promising light, air, and a modern way of living, though in time, some carried their own difficulties. New towns such as Milton Keynes, launched in 1967, carried the idea further. Carefully planned streets, shopping centres and schools designed for a car-based future. The motorway system was already spreading. Its first stretch of the M1 opened in 1959, but by the mid-60s, long grey ribbons of road reached north and south, reshaping the speed of travel. Clothes gave visible form to the new spirit. The miniskirt appeared on pavements and in shop windows. Mary Quant's designs placing London at the centre of world fashion. Carnaby Street filled with colour and patterns, hemlines climbing higher each season, while young men tried slimmer suits or bold shirts that set them apart from their fathers. With nearly half the population under 25 by 1966, this shift in appearance was not a small one. It marked how a generation claimed its own voice without saying a word. Still, the decade carried unease beneath its bright surface. By 1967, unemployment edged above 500,000, strikes shook factories, and arguments over immigration laws revealed tensions about identity and belonging. For many households, however, steady wages and the steady drop in the price of consumer goods brought a feeling that progress was real, even if fragile. To stand in Britain in that decade was to feel pulled between past and future, with coal smoke lingering over rooftops while colour television flickered indoors and pop records echoed through rising tower blocks. This was Britain in the 60s.